in the dark. I've moved, and you would only see a load of pile of boxes behind me. So maybe that's not such a bad thing. Now, I am going to share my presentation. I'm hoping that you can all see that. Perhaps if somebody can see the thumbs up to let me know that you can see my presentation. Fantastic, thank you.
We can see it. We can see it, Neil, but we can see the slide to the left as well. So maybe you need to hit present mode at the top left.
Yeah. Well,
or present in Teams, that one there.
Yeah. That's not gone well.
There's also the button at the top left next to the refresh button. That looks like a little.
Why are you seeing that? Hang on.
Well, it's all right. If we can't get into present mode, it should be fine.
If you go to the bottom of your screen, there's a full screen button at the very bottom of your screen.
There we go. Can you see that?
The other option is to go for slideshow in the PowerPoint.
Oh, wrong way. Okay, I'm assuming you can all see my first slide. I am afraid it's a little bit wordy. However, I just want to go through where the energy footprint tool, or the EFT as we refer to it, actually comes from. And that rather long paragraph, monitoring and reporting carbon emissions, that was in the net zero action plan, and that's laid out the plans that we were going to use the energy footprint tool, which we licensed from the Church of England. It's a transparent tool, and it's fairly easy to for everybody to use. The net zero action plan also has a number of desired outcomes.
Neil, sorry, you're still on the first slide, the cover slide.
Have I not moved? Hang on, apologies. Why am I?
Neil, you could just try stopping sharing and then try sharing again.
Hang on.
Or if you just go to slideshow on the PowerPoint, I think that'll activate it.
Hang on, I was just saying to Jack, I really don't like Teams, so I'd much prefer. That's right, I don't like. I much prefer Teams, and I had it all set up. Bear with. Hang on.
Yeah, that's better.
Can you see it?
We can see the presentation mode, so we can see the next slide, but it is probably fine.
It's not good. Hang on. I'll stop and start again. Apologies. Right. Let's do it again.
If you're using a monitor, Neil, you need to select to share your second screen, because that's where the slides will go.
I'm sharing off my laptop.
Okay.
You are screen sharing. Can you see that now?
We can see it, but we could also see your notes.
Don't worry about that. They're not very exciting. And not all of them have it. So I should go back to desired outcomes of the net zero action plan. There's a couple that are quite interesting that I'm going to come back to, because the EFT does feed into this. The first one you see is 95% of all charges and offices will switch to a verified 100% renewable tariff by 2026, or at the point of contract renewal. And some of the EFT data shines a light on this. And there's a couple of other things in there, particularly outcome 2.4 as well, referring to heating systems. And the EFT provides some very interesting data that pertains to this. So I shall move on to the next slide. Just want to clarify, because I know many of you have completed the EFT, what is and what isn't in scope. It's essentially our buildings, so that's our churches, our church halls, our diocesan offices, and the provincial office, and the numerous miscellaneous buildings that the church owns, which across the various dioceses, there's an eclectic selection, shall we say. What is not in scope is clergy housing. We're not interested in the housing that our clergy live in. Also, some of our congregation meet in churches which we don't own the building. So for the point of the EFT, we're not interested in that. And also any properties we rent out to other organisations. Essentially, the carbon footprint belongs to them rather than ourselves. And the data that we're collecting, it's a fairly simple form. We streamlined it last year with the help of the Church of England. And essentially, we are looking for your electricity usage for heating and your lighting. For some of our charges, they use gas, oil, or LPG for their heating. And some of these are on your renewable tariffs. So those are the questions I'm sure those of you who completed it will have seen. And the units we're looking for is ideally kilowatt hours for your electricity and gas. These are commonly shown on your utility bills, and this is the best data if we can get it. For your oil, we are only interested in the litres that you have purchased in the calendar year that the EFT is running. If all else fails, a monetary value will work in the EFT, and there is a box for that. However, the data from it is a wee bit less accurate, partly because sometimes that may include VAT, standing charges, that kind of thing. So when we ask for your data, ideally kilowatt hours or your litres, we understand that's not always possible. I'm sure many of you have seen this slide before. This essentially shows how the EFT does all the maths for us. We put in our activity data, that's our kilowatt hours or our litres of oil. There's a embedded emission factor, and that gives us the greenhouse gas emissions, and that's the figures you see on the final sheet of the EFT when you submit it. And there's a very simple worked example there, 1,000 kilowatts of natural gas. The emission factor at the time of this, I did this slide, was 0.183. So that gives us 183 kilograms of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions for our usage of 1,000 kilowatts of natural gas. The conversion factors, they're provided by the UK government. They're updated annually. If any of you have ever looked at the website, there is a vast number of different tables they use for all kinds of things, not just the energy we use in our churches, anything from using an electric car, your train travel, bus travel, all kinds of things are there, and that's uprated usually on the 10th of June every year, and that's where the Church of England get their conversion factors from. We don't have any say in that, and it's all done for us. I did a little bit of research actually in the conversion factors per kilowatt hour using these historical data sets provided by the UK government. And the interesting thing there is the green line is oil, the orange line is gas, and that blue line is electricity. And the small print at the bottom, provided by the UK government, explains why that blue line, why it's decreasing. And it's essentially because we are using more renewable power sources in our energy generation for our power. So over time, from 2018, 2019, that has fallen, partly because coal is no longer in the mix, but also because we are using more renewables. And as you can see, the conversion factor for electricity has now dipped below that of gas. So of the three sources of energy sources, that is the one which is producing the least amount of carbon emissions, and that will be the case as we continue to use more and more renewables. So now, perhaps for those of you who completed the EFT, what did we find out? The EFT, I have all of the results from across the province and all kinds of things we've discovered. The first one I'm going to look at is the fact that many of our charges have a renewable tariff. And if you can see point 1 to the left, that's how much each diocese would have emitted had there not been the use of renewable tariffs. And the figure point 2 on the right hand side, that is the actual emissions. The blue line is Edinburgh, the purple one is Glasgow. That's not unexpected because they have the largest number of charges and a lot of them are on renewable tariffs. So they have made the most impact as far as that is concerned. I'm going to come back to that because we can reduce the SEC's overall carbon footprint by moving to renewable tariffs, and it is a point that I will return back to. But as you can see from that graph, we have saved around 500 tonnes of carbon that we would have potentially used if we hadn't used renewable tariffs. There is, of course, potential for more reductions. Not all of our charges are on renewable tariffs. This is a slide that I've put together just a couple of hours ago. I've only just finished working on this data. And for each of the dioceses there, you can see that if those charges within the diocese were to move to a renewable tariff as set out in the Net Zero Action Plan, that's the kinds of tonnages we can potentially remove from our overall carbon footprints. Across the province, that's another 378 tonnes we can potentially remove from the overall carbon footprint. But as I say, I've only just been working on this data this morning, so there will be further updates to follow, which will be made available to the diocese. So how are we doing? This little chart I've put together, it essentially looks across the province and the number of percentage of diocese, charges in the diocese are on renewable tariffs. Province-wide, that's just over 30%. There's variation within that. I think it's important to remember that not all diocesan sizes are the same. But as you can see, there's still some way to go to reach desired outcome 2.1, is to have 95% of all charges moving over to a verified renewable tariff by 2026, or the point of contract renewal. I appreciate some charges are on fairly long-term contracts, which may stretch beyond 2028, but there is a little bit of work still to be done. What else did we find out? We found out that 50 of our charges are emitting under 1 tonne of CO2. That's 18.5% of the submissions. It's not spread evenly. The more rural charges, particularly further north, MRC, Aberdeen, Orkney, as you'd expect, smaller churches, less services, perhaps not open to the public, will inevitably use less energy and have a smaller carbon footprint. I think the one standout figure there is the 20% for Edinburgh, but that's perhaps not to be the whole expectations. The charges further north and more rural parishes will have smaller carbon footprints. I looked at the other end of the scale. One of the things we've asked to look for, the top 25% of the emitters across the province, that constitutes 68. We looked at 271. As perhaps we would expect, the majority of those tend to fall within the central belts. Again, these are bigger churches. They're busy churches, they have a fair amount of services, a number of tourists visit these churches as well. So it's perhaps not unsurprising that some of the larger churches in Glasgow and Edinburgh do fall within the top 25%. Conversely, of course, the smaller charges further north and west again constitute a much smaller amount. And the emissions from these 68 charges, just over 108 tonnes down to about 9.5 tonnes, whereas the average for all of our charges is just over, it's around 8.3 tonnes. And this is really helpful. It's not a finger pointing exercise, but it helps the net zero team identify the charges that perhaps we need to focus on. Reducing their emissions will make a far greater difference to the overall carbon footprint of the province. It's extremely helpful to target the limited resources of the net zero team to those charges who are perhaps looking to make these changes the next year or two. What else did we find out? I looked at from the data we had last year, that's in the green, and this year we have the data is in purple. There were an additional 90 responses this year, and I have actually split that data up into emission bands. So we can see that on the right hand side, yes, there's a few of our charges who are extremely high emitters. To the left hand side, there's quite a lot of our charges that are extremely small, and most of them are grouped in the middle. As I said, our average is around 8.3 tonnes, and as we move towards net zero, we will see a shift in those heights of those bars as it progresses over towards the left. And we will be able to track this year on year. The EFT also tells us how our charges heat, that they're buildings. I've just picked randomly on 4 of the dioceses. There are there is obviously Edinburgh's central belt and some big churches, and there's gas, whereas further north there is not gas. It's interesting that certainly for Edinburgh, and the same is true for Glasgow, the majority of our buildings are heated by gas, whereas some of the other charges further north have more renewable sources, and also oil. There are 3 dioceses that still have charges with oil heating. Oil is particularly heavy on the carbon footprint side. So again, it gives us an idea of where we need to focus our energies to help those charges transition away from oil. This little chart just shows that 15% of our charges use renewable electricity for heating, not lighting, but heating as well. 7% use renewable gas for heating, and we still have 8% of our charges across the province using oil. However, the majority, that's 41%, heat with gas. Desired outcome 2.4 in the Net Zero Action Plan states that 33% of all heating systems are zero direct emissions by 2026 and 85% by 2029. So clearly we still have work to do to move towards that state of affairs. Excuse me. Again, I was working on this morning, so I'm afraid it's a little bit basic, this chart, but this gives us an idea of where by diocese where our emissions are coming from. I've split that between electric, gas, oil and others. We have a pellet burner and a couple of LPG in usage by a couple of charges, but by and large 68% of our emissions is carbon emissions come from the use of gas heating. Oil is relatively low at 10%, and the remaining 21% is from electric. So clearly we need to think about transitioning from oil, gas towards electric, and on a renewable tariff. That will bring down the carbon footprint of our charges and the diocese. And I guess the headline figure, which is buried a little bit down at the bottom, is in 2024, the province emitted 2,264 tonnes of CO2. That's the carbon footprint of our buildings. It's roughly in line where we were last year. However, we have more and better data, and we will see that figure fall. It's certainly smaller than what was originally predicted back in 2018, when we did not have so much data to use and look at. So the EFT has basically enabled us to have a far better picture of what we use, what the carbon footprint is, and where we can start focusing our energy to start to reduce that carbon footprint. Excuse me. So I'm going to end that little presentation with some questions. I shall stop sharing and I will ask Jack to open the floor to any questions.
Thank you. Thank you for all that. And as people digest and I guess prepare to ask questions, I can read what's been put in the chat so far. So Donald said UK conversion factor is not appropriate for electricity. Scotland has a much lower, almost zero fossil fuel use compared with England. Why do we use the Church of England figure? Our SEC electricity footprint figures will therefore be significantly lower than has been reported.
There are no Scottish data available. That's the only data we have.
Also, you're still sharing.
Hang on.
You need to go to the stop button at the top. Yeah, there you go.
There we go. Perfect. That's the UK data figures. We don't have any other data or conversion factors, and that's what everybody uses. So yes, we are stuck with them.
Yeah, I mean, just to say it's wrong because of that. Because I mean, on the Isle of Skye here, we export all our electricity because we only have we have hydro and wind only. So the nearest fossil fuel for us is about 500 miles away, I think. So you know, it's going to give you a wrong picture. I appreciate if there are no data, but I think we ought to we could do a kind of back of the envelope calculation to say roughly how far do we think that's probably overestimating our footprint. I mean, I don't know if Alan Werrity has any thoughts on the subject because he used to do some work in this field.
We're just reporting on what the EF data tells us. We do not calculate the emission factors. That's not in our remit. And we license the tool from the Church of England. So yeah, we are where we are. This is the best tool we have. And
fair enough.
The purpose is to report back what we found on that. But I take your point. Yes, it's a inequitable distribution. Certainly, if you're in the south of England, a lot of your energy may be coming from France.
And Donald had just put something else in the chat during the presentation, that oil is high in Argyll and the Isles because quite a lot of churches in Argyll and Isle don't have gas. Emmanuel put in the chat, what is the best and cheapest way to heat a cathedral? Are there specific grants that could help with that, and what are they?
There are one or two grant funders that are cathedral specific. There are provincial funds to do that, but as everybody will appreciate, our cathedrals are by and large our biggest buildings, and we have to perhaps think a little bit differently. How do we heat such a huge space? Certainly in Edinburgh, they have put in some radiant heaters in the Lady Chapel, and are considering that as well as possibly the use of air source or ground source heat pump. It is something that is an issue for all of our larger churches and cathedrals to heat old Victorian buildings by and large. But what the EFT is telling us, probably what we already knew, but in some more detail, is just how much the cathedrals are emitting what the size of their carbon footprint. Again, I would welcome you to come and talk to the team, because we can perhaps work with you on the cathedral and the solutions that other cathedrals and large churches are working on. So again, this webinar is more about what we found out, but I would encourage you to come and speak to my colleagues and myself about the solutions, and more importantly, where's the funding to do this work to reduce the carbon footprints of our buildings and cathedrals.
There's a few more things been put in the chat here from John. It says, from Scottish Government, in 2022, there was 35 g of CO2 emissions per kilowatt of greenhouse gas emissions associated with electricity generation in Scotland. I don't know if that requires a response, but do you want to say anything to that?
Again, this webinar is more about reporting what we found out rather than the Scottish Government policy. We do, on occasions, communicate with Scottish Government, because clearly they have a fair amount of control on policy and also funding for things like CARES and that. But yeah, I can't really comment on Scottish Government and what Scottish Government is or isn't doing.
Okay, Guy said we need 3-phase electricity in Old St. Paul's, which has made getting a renewable tariff difficult.
That unfortunately is not not an uncommon problem. 3-phase is pretty much required for your solar panels, that kind of thing. Now, I've travelled across, particularly the Edinburgh Diocese, most of the charges, and some of the small ones do have 3-phase and some don't. I can tell you that one of the charges in the Edinburgh Diocese got a grant from the province to put in a 3-phase supply. So you can get provincial money for this. It's been done before. It was done earlier this year, back in the last year. So if you want to put a 3-phase supply in because you do not have it for your church, please do go to the Net Zero web portal, and under funding, there is money available for that kind of work. So yes, we appreciate that not all of our churches have 3-phase, but on the same token, we do have money has been made available for that kind of work.
Rebecca has said it would be interesting to see the actual pound figure related to the emissions of each energy source being used.
I am sure that those that are treasurers or on vestry will have seen their accounts, which are submitted to OSCR every year. I have seen plenty, and yes, some of our charges spend a large amount of their money on their utility bills. Certainly by transitioning to net zero, if you've got grant funding for that kind of thing, you can reduce those utility bills. And for those of you who know me, I am sure you'll have heard this mantra before: the more money you save on your utility bills is more money for mission. So it's not just about cutting our carbon footprint, it's also about saving your church money, going to these big corporations and keeping it in your pocket where it belongs.
So the conversation is ongoing about the conversion figures. I'm not going to read that out necessarily. And there's a question about changing a gas cooker to an electric one. So I'm also not going to read that out. Bethany contact for the diocese from which that person is representing. So I believe that there's a question about how much it costs to move to three-phase.
You'd have to
Does
ask
anyone
your, your energy provider. It depends how much of the road they have to dig up. It's essentially what it comes down to, where the nearest three-phase supply is. But again, that would be down to SSPN or who's the other one? The other provider. I think it's Scottish Power. But they will be able to provide you a quote if you need to have three-phase. I see Val's got her hand up.
Yes,
I just
Go ahead.
thought maybe just to add into the conversation on three-phase power, quite rightly, as Neil said, it does depend on whether or not you have to have road closures, the roads dug up with the local authority, and obviously the distance involved. For example, St Mary's in Dalkeith, their three-phase power was to just really across the church grounds, so open ground, to the power supply that ran under a sort of a track in the country park, and they were quoted £18,000 for that to be done. In Pennycook, St James in Pennycook, their nearest three-phase power supply was across the road from the church, and they were quoted £30,000 to have that work done. But all of these works can be included in your grant applications, so it's not that you can't have it. It's just it will cost, and it does depend on distance and the kind of work that is necessary. The other issue, I noticed somebody in Dumfries and Galway, the issue also is whether or not changing your electricity usage is going to have an impact on the grid. And I know certainly in Inverness, the cathedral there are desperately wanting to make major changes and can't, because the electricity network in Inverness can't cope with a cathedral having a lot more electricity. So there are a lot of factors involved, and it's not cheap. But as I say, the grants are available, so you can put a proposal together that would include that. But you'll have to get estimates because every building is different.
Thank you, Val.
Guy?
Sorry, it's just continuing on the three-phase issue, and I certainly confess not to being completely on top of the technicalities of this, but my understanding is that at Old St Paul's in Edinburgh, we do have three-phase electricity, and we need it for various reasons, although we certainly don't have any solar panels because it wouldn't make sense where we are. But my understanding, and I could certainly I'll follow this up if necessary, is that because we have three-phase, we can't or have had great difficulty in getting a renewable tariff because of that. Does that make any sense, or am I wrong about that? I might be wrong.
Should not make any difference.
Mm-hmm. That's reassuring and helpful. I'll pursue that with the people in the church who take these decisions.
We have three-phase and we're on a renewable tariff.
Right.
Jack, do we want to just bring Daniel in, because he popped a response in the chat about
Yes, sure.
the electricity
Daniel.
grid and how it works in the UK, and I feel like it might be helpful for people who aren't following the chat. If you're there, Daniel, would you like to just jump in?
Sure. Yeah. So what I was trying to explain is that there is no Scottish figure for the for the emission factors if you live in Scotland and are drawing electricity from the grid. And the reason for that is that the grid is UK wide, and it represents a mix of generation from across the totality of the UK. So it includes all the solar, all the wind, it used to include coal, but we don't have coal anymore. It includes all the gas, all the nuclear, and everything that might come in through the interconnectors. And if we're drawing electricity up in Scotland, the kind of electrons that we're pulling into our houses, that'll be balanced by generation across the whole of the UK. So that's why there is one figure for the UK. And if you wish to get a lower figure in terms of your electricity generation, then the way to do that is to go to a renewable supplier, or certainly a supplier who doesn't purchase from fossil fuel generation. And that way, the electricity that you're that you're using is then matched against their purchasing, which is solely from non-fossil fuel suppliers. So it could be renewable, it could be wind turbines, it could be solar, it could also be nuclear, which has a similar footprint to renewables. So that's basically how it works in practice. And there is no Scottish emissions factors as such because of that reason.
Thank you, Daniel.
That's it.
Sorry, can I respond to that? Sorry, Scotland exports to the UK, rest of the UK primarily. So the idea that, the whole argument that it's based on a UK-wide grid would be fair enough if we were all sort of sharing across each other all the time. But if Scotland is a net exporter by a considerable degree, I can't quite see how that argument works.
Well, I see exactly where you're coming from, and I have just come down yesterday from Thurso and Wick, where they were saying the exact same point, because they are absolutely surrounded by wind farms up there. But that is the way it works, and it is a UK-wide pool of electricity that is shared. So that's the way it goes, I'm afraid.
Perhaps bringing the conversation back to the webinar itself. Electricity usage, as we saw in the EFT, is around 21%, and we're interested in the carbon footprint. Clearly, the carbon footprint is greatest from the use of gas and oil. So, yes, electricity is a component wherever it's generated, but the net zero team are more interested and focused on the use of oil, LPG, because that's used in 2 or 3 of our charges, and also the use of gas and transitioning away. And that's clearly demonstrated in the results from the EFT. So I guess, has anybody got some questions relating to the presentation? Perhaps we could want to discuss our discoveries. I can't see if things come up in the chat, but I don't know if you've got anything there, Bethany or Jack.
No, nothing has come through.
I thought the presentation was very good.
Thank you.
Right. There's 2 hands raised now. I'll go to Val first, but just to say, Neil, if there aren't any questions after that, perhaps you could give your perspective as the administrator of the EFT, essentially what you see as the misconceptions and what you wish perhaps charges knew or diocese knew. But we have 3 hands and a question in the chat first. So Val, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I was really pleased to see the presentation. I think you've put a huge amount of work in. Obviously, I am a member of the Provincial Environment Group, so I am very aware of the work of the staff and the team that are putting all this information together. I thought it was excellent, and regardless of conversion factors or whatever, it gives us a very clear indication of the trends of energy use across our churches, and I think that's what we need to focus on. The trend is very positive. There is a downward trend. Obviously, we're reducing our emissions to atmosphere, and not only does that help with climate change, but it also reduces the impacts on human health around the areas of churches. So, you know, I'm delighted to see that downward trend and the effort that people are putting in across all the charges. So well done to the team, and you know, but we must keep going. You know, this is a global crisis, and I think we really do need to do what we can to contribute to improving our own carbon footprint. It might cost us a little bit more. Moving to a green energy tariff sometimes might cost us a little bit more, and that's sometimes why treasurers are a bit reluctant to change tariff. But at the end of the day, as Christians and as people of God, you know, we are duty bound to try to protect God's creation, and therefore decarbonisation is the way to do it. So in this particular context, we will be looking at other work streams later, but for the moment, this is the focus. And so thanks to the team, I thought it was excellent, and I am so delighted to see that downward trend.
Thank you, Dr. Val, for that.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Alan, you raised your hand next.
Can I echo what Val has just said? A very thought-provoking presentation. Thinking of low-hanging fruit, I think the discussion on renewable energy tariffs is a really crucial one, and I wonder if that should be a major push in the immediate future, because clearly the immediate benefits of that are self-evident. I was also very taken by the analysis of the big carbon emitters as opposed to the smaller ones. And again, in terms of prioritizing actions, I would suggest it makes sense to really go after those charges which are the biggest charges in terms of energy usage, because they're the ones that hopefully are going to accelerate the reduction in carbon usage that we're looking for. So I'm asking whether that's a kind of a strategic view that the net zero team might want to promote.
Absolutely. It's clearly that's the one largest emitter emits as far more than the 50 smallest. So yes, there will be a focus on those charges that are larger emitters and focus the resources we have for that.
Great, and Guy?
I'm afraid I couldn't follow. It's maybe not necessary to go back to this, but I couldn't follow slide 8, partly because it was rather small on my screen. I know Neil, been a bit difficult sharing it all. I would have failed completely if I'd been trying to do what you were doing. So, but I just couldn't comparison between Glasgow and Edinburgh. I'm not being competitive, of course, here, but I couldn't follow the slide at all there.
It was just the number of charges. Top of my head, it's the larger emitters. That's primarily because those are our busiest churches. If you have 2-3 services on a Sunday, you're open to the public, you're a big building, you have lots of groups perhaps using your hall or the church space, it's inevitable you will have a greater energy usage. The EFT is not about finger pointing, it's about just identifying where those large emitters are and then helping those charges by putting resources their way, finding the grant funding for them. Certainly in the Edinburgh diocese, I have a number of larger charges that we're working with proactively on potentially very large projects, of which net zero is a component to bring those carbon footprints down. So yeah, the EFT is very helpful to identify the large emitters so that we can give them as much help as we possibly can.
So yeah, thanks, Neil. And maybe it'll be clearer when the recording and it's shared. No, I couldn't because it was small. I just couldn't understand what the graph meant at all on slide 8. It was unfortunate. It's just a reflection that for me and possibly for one or two others, the information and the graph was opaque.
Oh yeah, sorry. That's essentially the difference between being on a renewable tariff and not being on a renewable tariff, and the fact that a number of our charges are on renewable tariffs brings the gross carbon footprint down to a net carbon footprint. And Glasgow and Edinburgh are kind of the top of that graph purely because there's more of them. And they tend to be larger energy users. So that's why it looks, compared to the other dioceses, a greater fall. But it's more to do with the size of the diocese. But the EFT does actually show us that data. So it's just another facet of what the EFT can actually do for us.
And aside from that, just one observation which struck me, and I may be I've got my sums completely wrong here, but it looked to me as though the average annual CO, please correct me, Neil, if I've got this wrong, the average annual CO2 emissions for the average church, Episcopal Church in Scotland, at about 8 point something tons.
8.3 tons, yes.
Is more or less the same as the emissions of the one average UK citizen for a year, I think. And
right,
if I think about
I'm
that,
not familiar with the.
it's just interesting. I'm pretty familiar because these figures are quoted a lot when you compare richest countries, which are causing all the problems and have very big emissions per citizens, and the poor countries, which have caused no problems really in terms of climate change, have emissions of 1 or 2 tons per any citizen per year. And anyway, just I think I may be right about if it is true, then it's just an interesting comparison, I think.
And I think that's really helpful to encourage us to look at reducing our charges, overall carbon footprint and emissions. And I appreciate time's ticking on. And
yes,
I would like to thank all of you who have completed the EFT over the last year. The information is very, very helpful. And we do make good use of it. The information will be going to PEG, and Standing Committee want to report on the findings. So this information is taken seriously. And about February, maybe early March next year, we will be asking you for 2025 data. So I would encourage all of you, if you are responsible for filling the EFT, or the treasurer or member of the congregation who are, to please complete it in a timely fashion, because we find this information extremely helpful, and you don't want me or my colleagues endlessly badgering you for this information. The form is very, very simple to complete, and you also get a picture of what your charge is doing over time. So it's a big thank you for all of those who have completed it, and also an appeal to continue to complete it in the coming years, and encourage those who do to carry on doing that.
Thank you, Neil. In the last few minutes, there's a good amount of things in the chat. Unfortunately, I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to read out the questions, not the comments. If after I read out the questions, people who made any of these comments would really like them to be heard, I would welcome you to raise your hand and you can voice them yourself. I would suggest we go through these quite quickly so we can get an answer to as many as we can. It's from Donald. Having got heating and lighting data recorded, can we now add in clergy mileage and thus transport emissions to the tool?
The EFT can calculate transport. It has been looked into. Daniel did a webinar on this last week, and there is grant funding. But at some point, we will again start to calculate travel emissions.
Okay. Next is from John. I can't remember, but does the tool allow churches to benchmark themselves against other churches?
It doesn't. However, the information will be shared with across the diocese. It will be up to the individual dioceses how they share that information down to the charges. Clearly, we have a list of where everybody sits within that, but it's not our intention to compare one church against another. That's a little bit unfair. However, that information will go down to the dioceses, and it will be in their gift how they share that information and benchmark against each other. However, you can see some of the graphics we looked at. I put it all into bands of emissions. That can be broken down by diocese as well. So all that information will be shared, but I'm reluctant to compare one charge against another.
Right. I think that answers another question that was asked from Wendy about the sharing of the data. To move on, large emitters, do we have also a factor of emissions versus hours the church is being used? You could have a large total emissions with a very low carbon heating system.
It takes, I mean, it's not a finger pointing exercise, and all the charges are different sizes, and quite clearly a busy church will have larger emissions. There is a large busy church in the centre of Edinburgh, I won't say which one, had a carbon footprint of around 68 tonnes, transitioned to renewable electricity and gas. It's brought its carbon footprint down to around 9 tonnes. So it is possible reducing that 9 tonnes even further is going to be harder for them, but they are thinking about it. But we appreciate that these busy charges will have a larger carbon footprint, but they are again the ones that we are focusing our attention on in helping to bring that carbon footprint down.
Yeah, and I would add to that as well that we, of course, want to see our churches being used as much as possible. So there is a way that we will try to work with every church to find the most sensible solutions to things, but any opportunity where you're able to use your church building in new, additional, supportive ways is, of course, a blessing. From John, do you have comparative energy usage per communicant / average attendee across the churches?
That is possible using my rather outdated little red book, and also some other data we've got on numbers of communicants. It would take me some considerable time, and that would have to be discussed as to whether that's a good use of my time, bearing in mind I do a lot of other things as well. But it is possible, and if a particular charge or diocese wanted that information, I'm sure we could break it down even further.
Right. And the last two questions that are in here right now, I can kind of combine. Guy asks, when should we fill the EFT again? And then Bunny has said, for the figures on usage, would it be useful to take meter readings on a set date each year that falls in with your survey? What is the critical date? No, ours is estimated because bills were confusing with poor estimates and charges.
I wish I had £1 for every time somebody's had a problem with their bills. It's so many charges come to me and have had issues with their energy suppliers. I really do feel for them. The 2025 EFT will open probably next February. We will email everybody at the time. Meter readings, please steer away from them because they are not accurate. What we really need is the usage shown on the energy bill. Clearly, if that's estimated, that may not be right, but we can use it and it will eventually be corrected. There is a cathedral near where I live that inadvertently used meter readings, and we had a very big EFT footprint last year. That's now been corrected and it's reduced it by 50%. So please don't enter your meter readings. You will get a carbon footprint that is much, much greater than it actually is. So any questions, any doubts on your EFT, please, please, please do let myself or one of my colleagues know, and we will go through it and make sure that you have the most useful, accurate data possible to enter into the EFT. So I would encourage you to be in touch if you have any doubts over your EFT, and again, encourage you once we open the 2025 EFT to complete it.
Great. Well, I don't see any further questions in the chat, and we're just over 2 o'clock. So in the absence of any pressing questions coming in, we'll probably draw this to a close. You are, of course, always welcome to reach out to any of the members, either the one specifically associated with your diocese or any other with any further questions or help with anything relating to filling out the EFT or energy or projects or anything else. So I'd just like to thank you all for your time and thank you in advance for your assistance in completing the EFT next year. And of course, to thank you for all the work that you've done filling it out this year and last. So I hope you have a good rest of your day and thank you for your continued engagement.
Thank you.